attend our presentation today in support of the Master Plan of Transportation. So take it away, Alex.
Great, thanks, Crystal. And I think I just saw a notification that we're recording, so just so everyone's aware that that's happening. So thanks, Crystal. I'm Alex Rixey with Fair and Peers. I'm the Deputy Project Manager for the consultant team that also includes Aceto Consulting, Tool Design, RK&K, and Lardner Klein. And we're supporting the Prince George's County planning staff in developing the Prince George's County Master Plan of Transportation. So thank you all for joining today. We're here to give a complete streets training and really want this to be a kind of interactive discussion. I'm going to also pitch it over to introduce my co-presenters, Matthew and Anjali, and then we'll give a little bit of context and just an overview of the training for today so everybody can get their bearings. And then I'd like to go around the phone and also have a chance for everybody to introduce themselves. So Matthew, you want to go next?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Matthew Ridgway. I'm a principal with Fair and Peers. I'm the principal in charge of the East, so oversee DC and Orlando. But before having that responsibility, I grew up in our California offices and actually developed what is now a 3-day training course for Caltrans and UC Berkeley Tech Transfer on complete streets. A lot of what you're going to see today is trying to fit 3 days worth of material into 2.5 hours. So there's a lot of consolidation and summarization. And if you have questions and want more depth, I would encourage you to reach out to us and just let us know what depth you would like, because we are going to try to cover a lot today. Pleasure to be here with you all. Anjali?
Good afternoon. My name is Anjali Tapia, and I'm a transportation engineer with Fair and Peers with a passion for complete streets design. So looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you both. So I'll just give a little bit of background. This placemaking training, as I mentioned, is part of the broader update to the Master Plan of Transportation. So we'll be focused today largely on our scope called for civil engineering solutions to activating public spaces and using public rights of way to support activity or mitigate the impacts of vehicle travel. But we'll start with a little more of a higher level framing around complete streets. We have a lot of design information that we'll share in the second half of the presentation, but just wanted to make sure that there was a framework to hang all of those pieces on. So learning objectives for today, this is kind of the higher level piece that I was talking about. We'll start with defining complete streets, go through a little bit of assessing the elements of a well-written complete streets policy, share some information about complete streets in the context of place types, street typologies, and layered networks, talk about evaluation metrics for complete streets, and then some common challenges and barriers to complete streets implementation. And then, as I mentioned, for the latter half of the presentation, we'll really dive into the roadway intersection design concepts and how those can be influential for a successful complete streets program. So sort of how that breaks down time-wise, we'll go shortly here into introductions, and we rarely get a chance to put faces with names these days, so I'm going to turn off the slide sharing and ask folks to turn on their cameras as they're speaking if they're comfortable doing that, just so we can get to know everybody. We'll then go into that higher level implementation framework overview, talking about policy, trade-offs, the typologies of layer networks, and then the multimodal performance measures. And then we did build in a quick break, so we'll have about an hour of content and then take a quick 10-minute break and then come back for a little less than, we'll go for 80 minutes, not quite 90 minutes, with more of the design concepts. So with that kind of high level overview, I'd like to go back to introductions and go around the line. I'll stop sharing my screen and I think maybe go to Crystal first, who is our fearless leader on the county side. And then after that, also Crystal, give you a chance to introduce anybody you want to, and then we'll just go down the list of participants that I have in front of me.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Alex mentioned, I am Crystal Saunders Hancock. I am serving as the project lead along with our team for the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. So thank you again for attending. I'm sure I'll be calling on you for some other things, so get ready. Thank you. Do you want me to go through my team? I'm sorry, I was trying to pay attention. If you want me to go
yeah,
through
if there's anybody else you want to introduce first.
Sure, I will turn my camera off and I'll just do the same thing. Mr. Burton, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I don't know if you can see me, but my name is Glenn Burton. I'm a transportation planner with the Prince George's County Planning Department.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson, can we get you to introduce yourself? I'm just going to introduce our park and planning staff.
Hi, good afternoon, all. I am Michael Jackson. I'm a planner with the Prince George's County Planning Department and happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And just while you're on the screen, I wanted to give a special thank you for all of your feedback on the presentation and for all the images you shared. As we go through the presentation, you'll see a lot of local examples of Prince George's County and local regional complete streets. And Michael provided just about all of those. So thank you very much for that.
Awesome. You're on mute, Michael, if you're saying something.
You're quite welcome, Alex. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Perfect. Next, we have Mr. Ben Patrick.
Hi, everyone. Ben Patrick, Transportation Section.
Thank you. Next, we have Mr. Jim Yang.
Hey, my name is Jim Yang, and I'm working on the travel forecasting model with Manfredo. Thank you.
And next, we have Ben Ryan.
Hi, everyone. Benjamin Ryan. I'm a planner in the transportation planning section.
Awesome. Next, we have our supervisor, Will Capers.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Capers. I'm the Transportation Planning Supervisor with the Department of Planning. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have our Deputy Project Manager, Ms. Judith Howerton.
Judith Howerton with the Transportation Planning Section. Thank you.
And I think that's all of our internal staff, but we do have some staff from DPW&T as well as the consultant staff as well as our municipality. So thank you all again for attending. Alex, you take it away.
All right, thanks. Yeah, it would be great to get introductions from everyone else on the line. So I'll just go down the participants list. And the first person I have is a number ending in 10. I think that's the only call-in number that's not showing up as a name.
This is Fabian Lucas from the Revenue Authority.
Oh, thanks. Good to have you with
Fabian,
us.
thank you, Fabian.
Thank you, Krista. I'll be in and out because I'm doing some other things, but I'll be in and out.
All good.
Thanks, Krista. Thanks. Okay.
Ginger Archibald.
Hi, this is Ginger Archibald. I'm the Metro Bus Service Planner for Maryland Bus Routes.
Great, thanks. Benita Danner.
Hi, I'm Benita Danner, Special Operations for the City of Seat Pleasant, Department of Public Works and Waste Management.
Great, thanks for joining us. Zachary Bishop.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Zach Bishop. I'm a planner here with the Department of Public Works and Transportation, and I help support the countywide Vision Zero program for Prince George's County.
Great, thanks. Next, I have Brad. Sorry, I don't have a last name.
Hi, I'm Brad Pudner. I'm the Public Works Director for Town of Berwyn Heights.
Great, thanks. We already heard from Glenn Burton and Will Capers. Kinsey Weems.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chief Weems. I'm the Chief of Police for the City of District Heights Police Department.
Great, thanks for joining us. Reynaldo de Guzman. Oh, looks like might have just dropped. Hal Metzler.
Hi, this is Hal Metzler. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Works for the City of Hyattsville.
Great, thanks. Thomas Hilton.
Tom Hilton, excuse me, Tom Hilton, WSSC Water Planning Division.
Great, thanks for joining us. Tiffany Jennings.
Good afternoon, I'm Tiffany Jennings, the Capital Bike Share Program Manager for Prince George's County, also the Bike and Pedestrian Program Manager with the Department of Public Works and Transportation.
Great, good to have you.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Jim Chandler.
Good afternoon. Jim Chandler, Assistant City Administrator and Director of Economic Development with the City of Hyattsville.
Great, thanks. Jim Sebastian.
Hey guys, Jim Sebastian, Senior Planner with Tool Design. We're focusing on the trails and the Vision Zero piece of the master plan.
Great, thanks, Jim. Joe Meinert.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Meinert. I'm the City of Bowie Planning Director, and I wanted you all to know that the City Council has a complete streets policy as of 2019. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Mike McMahon.
Good afternoon. Mike McMahon. I'm with the City of New Carrollton. I'm the Assistant City Administrator.
Great, thanks. Molly Porter.
Good afternoon, Molly Porter, Community Planner for City of Greenbelt.
Good to have you, Molly. Odessa Phillip.
Hi, good afternoon. Odessa Phillip from Aceto Consulting, and I'm part of the consultant team working on the engagement for the MPOT 2035.
Thanks, Odessa. Peter Campanides.
Pesky mute.
Gets you every time.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Campanides. I'm the Assistant District Engineer for Traffic with Maryland Department of Transportation State Highway Administration.
Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Rick Keegle. You're muted, Rick.
Sorry about that, everyone. Rick Keegle, Project Manager with RK&K, working on the consultant team with roadway right-of-way and transit.
Thanks. Denise Robinson.
Sorry, the mute button got me as well. Good afternoon, Denise Robinson, Assistant DCAO with the County Executive Office in Prince George's County.
Great, thank you. Kimberly Six.
Good afternoon, Kimberly Six, Water and Wastewater Planning Section Manager, Plan Division, WSSC Water.
Great, thank you. Ebony Stocks.
Hi, Ebony Stocks, Executive Vice President with Economic Development Corporation.
Great, thank you. Terry Ruby.
Yes, Terry Ruby, Director of Planning and Community Development for City of Greenbelt.
Great, thank you. Terry Shum.
That mute button again. Terry Shum, I'm the Planning Director for the City of College Park, and I'd also like to add that the city about 5 years ago, so ahead of the City of Bowie, adopted a complete and green streets policy. Not that we're in competition with each other, though. Nice to be here.
Good to have you. Sounds like some friendly competition. It's always nice to have everyone kind of raising the bar for each other.
Yeah.
The next person I have is just identified as Town Administrator. Okay, maybe we'll keep moving. Is it Nima? I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. Upadhyay?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nima Upadhyay. I'm the Senior Planner at DPWNT, and nice to be a part of this training today.
Great, thank you for joining us. Tim Von Stetten.
Hi, everyone. Tim Von Stetten. I'm a graduate student intern with the Transportation Planning section.
Thanks. Stephanie Walder.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Walder. I'm a project manager in the Highway Bridge Design Division of Prince George's County and work on a lot of engineering projects. And I'm sharing that in the chat since I can't join the training today. But thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, just lost my list here. Victor Weisberg.
Hi, Vic Weisberg with the Department of Public Works and Transportation. Thank you for putting this on today. I'm a major projects manager, and since there's not a competition, I just wanted to note that the county has had a complete green streets policy for so long I don't even remember. I think it was 2013. So.
Great, thank you. And Claire Worstill?
Hi, Claire Worstill. I'm with the Department of Parks and Recreation. I'm our lead strategic park planner, Prince George's County.
Great, good to have you here. Is there anyone I missed or who joined since we started who'd like to introduce themselves? Okay. Hearing none, we'll dive right back into the presentation. Get my screen back up. Okay, and before I do dive back in, just wanted to echo Crystal's sentiment in the chat that we're going to try to keep this moving to try to wrap up in the time that we have allotted here, but definitely want to encourage folks to chime in or ask questions as we're going, so don't be shy. So the first piece, thinking about defining complete streets, I just wanted to kind of start with some warm-up slides just to get the juices flowing and just kind of some images of what might commonly be considered complete streets. This is an example of a temporary installation on Michigan Avenue in Santa Monica, California. And so this is kind of introducing the idea that complete streets can include elements that go beyond just transportation and mobility, that they can really be places for activation and for living and enjoying the public space. Here's another example from California and Fremont, California. I just wanted to call out here that there is a pedestrian bridge overhead in this image, but you might notice that there are a lot more people walking on the street than there are actually using that pedestrian bridge. So even when there's a safe and I think climate controlled option for people to travel between the two buildings that this connects, the most convenient route is often the one that people will take. And so just because there is an option doesn't mean that that's the only option and the one that people will choose. So here's an example of installing some pedestrian crossing enhancements to make the path that people are using more safe and comfortable. Here's a local example of the Rhode Island Avenue trolley trail where it crosses Berwyn Road in College Park. Some folks on the phone might recognize this. So just showing where complete streets as part of a broader network. So complete doesn't have to mean all modes on all of the locations, that there aren't motor vehicles allowed on the trolley trail, but there is an interaction between the trolley trail and the street adjacent to it. And you can see a raised crossing here of Berwyn Road. This next one is showing how streets can be flexible across time. So this is Lancaster Boulevard in Lancaster, California, and this was a 5-lane arterial. And with the introduction of this landscaped median, it can become a complete street that offers much more than that. So this road is still open to traffic. In this image, it's closed for a festival. So pedestrians are using all parts of the street, but during more regular operations, the travel lanes are still open. The median is used for diagonal parking, and there are still wide pedestrian facilities on both sides of the street. So just kind of introducing the concept of changes in the use of the street over time, that it can be dynamic. Here's another local example, the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. This is one that Michael shared with us that you might not always think of interstate highways when you think of complete streets, but this is an important facility and a key pedestrian and bicycle connection across the Potomac. So it's not just a vehicular conduit, but also a place for bicyclists and pedestrians to travel. And then lastly, we're going to focus mainly on the design and operation elements of streets today, but education is also an important component of this. And so the image on the left is the Perrywood Elementary School traffic garden. So helping younger road users understand how traffic control devices and the streets work. And the image on the right is showing an adult bike training, so helping adults learn to ride their bicycles safely on complete streets. So getting a little more into the nuts and bolts, this is a definition of complete streets from the National Complete Streets Coalition, which is part of Smart Growth America. I'll just read it here. Complete streets are streets for everyone. They're designed and operated to prioritize safety, comfort, and access to destinations for all people who use the street. And recently they've added some of this language that's especially people who have experienced systemic underinvestment or whose needs have not been met through a traditional transportation approach, including older adults, people living with disabilities, people who cannot afford or do not have access to a car, and Black, Native, Hispanic, or Latino, Latina, Latinx communities. And the definition goes on to say that complete streets make it easy to cross the street, walk to shops, jobs, and schools, bicycle to work, and move actively with assistive devices. They allow buses to run on time and make it safe for people to walk or move actively to and from train stations. And the National Complete Streets Coalition also has recommendations for local policies, and we'll go through some of the Maryland and Prince George's County specific policies here in a moment, and want everyone in the training to be thinking about how well those policies address these key points. So avoiding vague and non-committal statements, using clear and direct language, using words like facilities must or shall meet the needs of users, not that users may be considered. It's important to specify the users. So, for example, pedestrians, bicyclists, transit vehicles, et cetera. And to specify the actions that the policy is requiring, whether that's planning, design, reconstruction, maintenance, operations. And those policies can build on existing work, and a key piece is to not leave room for circumventing the requirements. So often policies include some exceptions, which we'll talk about, but to be a really effective complete streets policy, it's important to leave as narrow and as few of those exceptions as possible so that the complete streets elements are incorporated.
And Alex, if I can just amplify that a second, especially for those agencies who said they already have policies, congratulations, it's great. And if you guys want to have more friendly competition, it would be maybe looking at those last couple points and figuring out how strong your policies are. Michael Jackson, again, was nice enough to share some of the explicit exceptions that are in the Prince George's County Complete Streets policy. And so I think it is an area that is ever evolving and probably an area where all agencies can continue to make progress.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And I'd also note that the National Coalition for Complete Streets is also revisiting some of those policies and going through evaluation. It's one of their upcoming initiatives is to look back at some of the legacy policies that are really pioneers in this space and reconsider what they are doing well and what they could even be doing better to support complete streets. So getting to some of the local specific policies, this is from the State Highway Administration. The SHA shall, which is that great strong language, follow a complete streets approach that promotes MDOT's overarching mission to enhance the quality of life for Maryland citizens by providing a balanced and sustainable multimodal transportation system for safe, efficient passenger and freight movement. This complete streets approach will create a comprehensive multimodal network by ensuring connectivity for vehicles, bicycling, walking, transit, and freight trips throughout Maryland's transportation system. So a lot of that really great strong language, identifying specific users, using shall and will. This is a pretty strong example. Moving into the Maryland Code here, maybe because this is a little more legalistic, has a lot more exceptions and wiggle room. So a complete streets policy adopted in accordance with this section shall, there's the strong language again, be implemented with the objective of creating a comprehensive, integrated, and connected transportation network that allows users to choose among different modes of transportation. So that's great, but not specifying which modes of transportation. Ensure that all users are considered during the planning, design, construction, and reconstruction phases of facility. So really nice that they specified the activities, but are considered is not as strong as the specific actions that will be taken for those users. Benefit all users equitably as the extent feasible while taking into consideration the needs of the most underinvested and underserved communities. That's a great equity piece. When practicable, require the accommodation of other modes of transportation. That when practicable is a big out that allows some wiggle room.
Extent feasible in the prior one was too, sorry. Just wanted to pull that out.
Yep, thanks for keeping me honest. Recognize that all facilities are different and user needs should be balanced to ensure community enhancement. That is some helpful flexibility. And then incorporate best practices related to complete streets design features. And then at the bottom, and this is not the entire section, but this is the key language. And at the bottom, just note that there are exceptions may be adopted when circumstances or laws exist. So certainly laws are important. You can't do anything that's not legal, but circumstances are pretty open to interpretation. So this leaves a lot of flexibility and wiggle room too. Getting a little more local, this is the Plan 2035 Prince George's. This is the definition of complete streets that was included in that 2014 document. And I won't read this entire one out loud, but this is a bit more descriptive about what complete streets are, and not specific to how they should be implemented, but does include a lot of the key elements: sidewalks, bike lanes, special bus lanes, gives lots of illustrative examples of what a complete street can be. And then getting a little more specific still, the Prince George's County Code requires that all planned county financed and approved road, sidewalk, trail, and transit related construction and reconstruction projects shall include environmental, site design, and facilities for the combined use of motor, emergency, and freight vehicles, transit bicycles, and pedestrians. So once again, very strong, shall include these facilities and specifies specifically the users that are to be accommodated. But as we continue, here are those exceptions again. So except when cost shall be disproportionate to the projected need, or when such facilities would be inappropriate due to the nature of the project, including the context and character of the surrounding built and natural environment of the neighborhood or area. So again, here's some of that language that gives some wiggle room. And Matthew, I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that.
No, I think the point from earlier is just this sort of reinforces it.
Okay, thanks. So just getting everybody up to speed and familiar with what the local guidance and regulations are. I'll move into some of the common trade-offs and challenges in implementing complete streets. So one important thing to keep in mind is that our choices affect different people differently, and it's important to think about all of the users of the street, and in particular when thinking about how we evaluate the performance of streets. And so this image is showing an older pedestrian making the crossing that generally looks like a pretty safe crossing. The treatments to slow vehicle speeds as they're approaching the crosswalk, but thinking about designing facilities for all users and where age can affect the ability to see or hear or move at a given rate across the intersection. Trade-offs in roadway capacity and level of service. So when thinking about improvements or changes to facilities, thinking about other project benefits that might outweigh the effects on the roadway capacity or level of service. Congestion is often a hot button topic and is inevitable, but it is still a choice to provide travel options in those moments. And so it's important to keep in mind also that roadway capacity and level of service can affect transit vehicle travel time, because they're also often sharing the same travel lanes as vehicular traffic, but weighing those needs along with other users, including bicyclists and pedestrians. And this is an example in West Hyattsville, just south of the Northwest Branch Trail, and there's a pedestrian crossing. So that when the pedestrian activates that pedestrian warning sign, vehicles need to slow and stop for the pedestrian crossing, and so that does have some implications on the travel times along this corridor, but provides a crossing for pedestrians. And there are additional considerations on providing even stronger protections for pedestrians at locations like this. Also thinking about person mobility, so level of service again is thinking about how well cars can move along corridors and intersections, but also important to think about person mobility and trade-offs in providing space for pedestrians to navigate intersections and along roadways. So this often becomes an issue when thinking about repurposing travel lanes, reconfiguring intersections, even adjusting signal operations. Often signal operations are optimized to reduce vehicle delay as much as possible. But it can be important to think also about the other users at the intersection and think about the total person delay at the intersection and not just the total vehicular delay. And so that can be a useful argument when thinking about whether data on the users of the facility can be helpful in making some of those changes, or if there's a more policy-driven argument that just as a matter of course, pedestrians need to be accommodated comfortably at the intersection. Some other common trade-offs, thinking about the use of right-of-way. Oftentimes projects that are envisioned might not fit within the existing right-of-way. And so it's a critical early project decision to think about whether you will need to stay within the existing right-of-way. This is an example on University Boulevard in Wheaton, where one of the travel lanes was repurposed to become a bus-only lane, or if there is political will to go beyond the existing right-of-way to expand the roadway to accommodate additional uses. Business access is also an important consideration and often is a trade-off with the safety and comfort of vulnerable road users. So this is an example from Old Branch Avenue in Camp Springs, Maryland, where the driveway access to this business essentially is the entire length of the street. I would think that even if the utility pole weren't there, probably that one little bit of curb would also be additional driveway. So it's important to think about the trade-offs in what business access the business really needs and how that can be traded off with the safety and comfort of pedestrians at the location, and really thinking about which elements of that are business needs and which are nice to haves in terms of quick, easy access in and out of the business. Parking is also a perennial question when looking to repurpose roadways for multiple users. Here's an example from the Wood Glen Drive cycle track in North Bethesda, where parking can be totally taken along an entire street or just repurposed at intersections to provide for longer sight distances. And when thinking about addressing that, looking at an occupancy study, you can see if you squint kind of in the distance here that there are only a couple of cars parked along this section, and that parking, just from looking at this image, might not be in particularly high demand. And thinking about that public space as a shared resource and how it might best be allocated and whether the highest and best use of that is for parking or whether it might be for other users. Community and character values also important to keep in mind. And really this just comes down to engaging with stakeholders at the right time, and the right time really is rarely too soon. It's great to engage with the community early in the process and throughout the process to understand what the community's values are, and to develop projects that reflect those values and not just your own personal values. And important to communicate throughout the process how the community can get involved and express their values, needs, and concerns. And finally, mentioning maintenance, this was one of the topics that Michael brought up. Sidewalk maintenance, this is from the Maryland Code, is along state highways is the responsibility of the jurisdiction where the sidewalk is located. And SHA can reimburse local jurisdictions for the cost of reconstruction repairs when a facility has deteriorated beyond repair. But otherwise, just repairing as a matter of course, the sidewalks is the jurisdiction's responsibility. And another issue with maintenance and operation of sidewalks is snow removal. So here's an image of where the roads have been plowed and the snow piles up at the crossing, and this would be an uncomfortable, if not impossible for some road users, location to cross. So just something else to think in mind, that even beyond when you construct and complete the facility, thinking about the way that it's operated and maintained and the implications that has for the users. Any questions or comments before we move on? Okay. Hearing none, I will pass it over to Matthew to talk about place types, street typologies, and layered networks.
Thanks, Alex. I hope that series of slides really points out that there's just a lot of trade-offs to be made, whether it's around vehicular level of service considerations or access considerations for local businesses, or even things like, even though it might be easiest to just move snow off of the street onto the adjacent sidewalk, that what is the implication of that on users? And so one of the things that many agencies are doing, and getting more and more state DOTs are getting involved in this now as well, is really trying to use context as a driving force to helping them to make those decisions. The idea is that you can use context to define sort of what your ambitions are for a specific area, acknowledging that in a highly urban area, you might have a much more robust set of multimodal and safety considerations, more emphasis on reduced auto speeds and potentially capacity than you would in a rural area, and that there's a whole range of different area types within that. The next slide shows how Florida has encapsulated that, and so they've used something called transects, and the idea is that the characteristics of a street can change as it's transitioning from, in this image, it's the sort of urban core areas are further over to the right, and then the more rural areas are further over to the left. And then in some instances, you might have certain things that stay constant across many of these context types, such as if it's a continuous corridor for moving automobiles, you might have a continuous sort of capacity that you're trying to maintain. But you might have other things that you vary, including things like the design speed or target speed, accommodation for bikes and peds, how much space is allocated for sidewalks, landscape treatments, sort of the types of amenities you might install. All of those are things that can be variable, and that using something that's context sensitive, that acknowledges sort of what's going on in that particular area, the land use that is, it can be a helpful decision maker or a helpful way to make decisions about which of those attributes are most important. The other theme that we often get into is one that is piloted in a study called Planning Urban Roadway Systems. It's a recommended practice from ITE that we were involved in writing, and it pilots this idea that I really wanted to call nested networks, but it got outweighed, and so it ultimately be called layered networks. But the idea is that that oftentimes you can accomplish continuous and connected networks for each mode, but you can also do that in a way that eliminates redundancy of use of a specific road for users that often don't get along well, at least not without some special accommodation. And sort of the classic example of that is bicyclists and transit vehicles. That if you're going to design a low-stress bikeway on a street that has buses operating in the curb lane, that oftentimes that involves a pretty significant amount of infrastructure investment, including buffering or even protecting the bike facility, and that's often not something that would fit within a constrained urban right-of-way. And so the idea is that could you take and look at these complete streets on a network basis and try to figure out, is there a way for me to accommodate bikes on one street, transit on another, such that you can do great facilities for both of those and have continuous and connected networks, but also try to eliminate conflicts where you can. I do want to make a point that again, Michael made with me, which I appreciate, which is just that you shouldn't use layered networks as an opportunity not to accommodate all modes. There is a need to accommodate all modes on all streets. It's really just about point of emphasis, or maybe even sort of tiebreakers in terms of which modes get the highest accommodation given different contexts. So I'll walk through an example in Westminster, California, and there's a series of these slides. The key thing to look at, or that I wanted to point out, is just that there is a street about, I'm sorry, first, what we're showing here is the bicycle and pedestrian priority network. So this is just one layer. All the green facilities are the bike and ped priority areas. There's a street going north-south, right smack in the center of this page. And you can see that it has bike and ped accommodations on it. And Alex, if you go to the next slide, you can see that same street does not have bike and ped accommodations. I'm sorry, does not have automobile priority accommodations. That is, the automobile priority is accomplished on the two parallel streets on the east and west of it. And so that's a good example of sort of, is there a comment or question? That's a good example of separating modes. And then it allows you to build essentially world-class facilities for bikes and peds on that bike ped street, and presumably accommodate auto movements more efficiently on the adjacent streets as well. And the next slide, it has the transit priority network. Again, the same street that had bicycle emphasis does not have transit priority. This is something that works really well when there is a grid of streets. And actually, if you go to the last slide of this sequence, Alex, and it does allow you to separate modes, but there's many areas of the U.S. and of Prince George's County that do not actually have very robust grids, and so, but nonetheless, the concept of using this type of analysis to figure out how you're going to prioritize modes is really useful. So the last one I'll go into is specifically from another example that we're working on in the city of Detroit and with the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, which takes this layered network and takes it a step further. I'm not going to go through the details of this of the process, but I will say that there's a long process around first doing the modal analysis, the network analysis to figure out sort of which modes are priority, and then identifying specific improvements you might implement on those streets to accommodate those modes. And then I think the other piece of this that Alex will get into later as well is then doing an analysis of how the recommended improvements affect those modes. So one of the really great things about being specific around modal priorities that allows you to sync up your performance measures. So if you have a street that is a transit priority street, then your performance measures for assessing how that street is performing should be based on transit criteria, things like level of amenities, or maybe it's transit travel times and reliability, but it allows you to sync those things up. So I'm going to walk through the map that we developed for the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. I think the other important part of this is just to note that this is actually funded by the Michigan Department of Transportation. And the reason that they funded it is because they were using a process that was the local communities were finding stymieing, that they called their road diet checklist for anything that talked about repurposing parking lanes or travel lanes or even reducing the width of lanes. And so they were looking for a tool that was a little more comprehensive and consideration of all modes. And so this is the one that we've prepared for them. And so it has both support at the state level and then also within Southeast Michigan. And so you can see in this instance, we've used that same context that we talked about, but overlaid it on an actual map of Detroit. If you're familiar with Detroit, then the red dot in the center of this map is downtown Detroit. And you can see that in a host of other areas that are essentially Main Street environments in the small towns and hamlets around Detroit all pop as red. And then, which is essentially sort of the urban context. And then beyond that is the sort of other urbanized areas of Detroit in orange, and then the suburban areas in blue, and then the rural areas in green. We've developed a series of maps, and I'm not going to pull up all of them, but I'll just pull up, I'll pull up the transit one first. So identifying transit priority streets, and this will take just a second to load. But the idea is that identifying for each mode the tiers of usage, and so the streets that are shown in the darkest red in this, or almost maroon, are really sort of the trunk transit lines. They operate, if you know Detroit, a lot of them operate on the radials that are the most direct routes in and out of downtown Detroit. And that there's a series of other tiers. So all those sort of trunk lines are tier 1, the highest priority for transit, and then if it's just a route on which transit operates 30-minute headways or less, then it might be considered a tier 2. And if it's a street on which there's no transit operating, then it would be considered a tier 3. So each of the modes has that kind of a tiering kind of process. I'll pull up the bike one too, just so you sort of get the gist of it. And then similar for cyclists and pedestrians, it's often a consideration of which of these facilities should have the highest priority for being low stress, so available to the widest group of users. 8 to 80 is the slogan that was thrown up about a decade ago and often still repeated. And so the idea is that these are the streets that would like to have bike priority as well. So I'm going to transition. This was used through a process to then identify modal priorities, and every time I talk about modal priorities with people get a little anxious about the idea of actually being explicit about what mode a street should serve as its priority. And the thing I always come back with is that if you don't have that upfront conversation, that sort of policy framework conversation about who you're trying to serve for the street, then you're not likely to hit on a solution that you get broad consensus on, because complete streets are really in the eye of the beholder. Transit advocates will have one idea of what a complete street represents, pet advocates another, and so on and so forth. So having that upfront conversation before you dive into the specifics of how to allocate space is actually actually really helpful. So in that Detroit example or the SEMCOG example, you can see that there are sort of these default modal priorities that are represented in this matrix on the bottom right of the current screen, and that those were developed in consensus. Detroit and other agency staff, as well as SEMCOG and Michigan DOT, and you can see that the modal priorities vary by street context. So for those Main Street and Hamlet and small town Hamlet streets, pedestrian is the highest priority. But in the suburban corridors and rural corridors, often auto is the highest priority. Sort of the other part of this is I talked quickly about the tiering system. That also plays a role in this. So even if you have a street that's in an urban or walkable thoroughfare where, according to this matrix, transit would be the highest priority, but if that is a street that doesn't actually have transit, then transit would be a tier 3, and so it would actually go on to the next priority order in that sequence, and so it would determine that pedestrian was the highest priority for that, and that would be based on whether pedestrian was considered a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So it gets a little involved in that. But the idea is that it actually produces then a modal priority, which is on the bottom left of this, and then that's a metric on which you can assess whether you've met the needs of that mode. And so the rest of this spreadsheet is a series of tabs that bake in actual assessments. So the first tab, which is the one I was already on, has some of the input values that you would use across all of the modes, things like traffic volume and speeds, and then configuration and context, lane configuration and context of the street itself, and then whether it's got transit, whether it's designated as a high capacity transit. And then the subsequent tabs use some of the information from that, but then a series of other things to really assess. So for pedestrian priority street, it's really focusing on user comfort. And so both in the bike and the ped realm, comfort is really a function of the amount of space allocated for that user, bike and ped, the amount of separation between that user and moving traffic, and then the speed and volume of the traffic that you're separating it from. PEDs also have considerations around crosswalk spacing and some things around amenities for landscape treatments and so forth. So PED scale lighting and so forth. And the actual result of this is a PED level of service that's a score of 1 to 4 that's comparable to a level of traffic stress for those of you who are familiar with that, with 1 and 2 being pretty good and 3 and 4 being less good, less comfortable places to walk. I won't go through the details, but it's a similar concept for bikes. One interesting thing about this particular one for SEMCOG is that LTS, as in its sort of raw form, doesn't do a really good job of considering interesting NACTO type bike treatments, and so we've baked in a lot of considerations around making sure we can assess LTS in bike facilities that are separated bikeways or buffered bike lanes and those types of things. A whole bunch of things around transit, which in Southeast Michigan is really focused on amenities for transit, shelters and the like. Auto is pretty simple based on VC ratio within expectation that for those streets that have an auto priority, the agency is likely to do a more detailed operations analysis of those. In addition to this is sort of a decision support tool and not a detailed operations analysis. And then freight is really a function of whether you have curb lane widths and accommodations for loading for freight. I think I'm going to stop sharing. And hopefully that's an example of sort of one agency that really dove into the developing these types of systems in a way that's sort of holistic, and we wanted to share that piece. Go ahead, Alex.
All right, thanks, Matthew. Gonna start sharing my screen again. Let's make sure that came up. All right. So moving in, Matthew kind of alluded to the idea that having these sorts of modal priorities also allow you to evaluate those streets based on selected performance measures. And so I want to pull back a little bit and talk about the alignment of performance measures with the planning objectives for the particular corridor, or even for complete streets more broadly. There we go. So this is an example of some work that we did for Montgomery County pretty recently. It was a few years back now, where we were asked to help them develop some transportation performance measurement tools. And before we got into that, we wanted to make sure that we were asking the big questions of what is it that we're trying to measure. So we took a lot of the goals and objectives that were stated in some of their existing planning documents and kind of arrayed them on this matrix of the modes to the left. So we have vehicle, transit, bicycle, and pedestrian. And then across the top, thinking of the different elements of a transportation network. So the land use and context, the network itself and how it's connected, the function and quality of how it's performing and the user experience on that, the level of use, and then safety as an important consideration. And we found that as we went through their planning documents and noted the kinds of goals and objectives that they had a pretty comprehensive set of goals across all of these modes and across all of these functions. And so the next step for us was to try to evaluate how well their current performance measures were addressing those. And that's where we found that where they had really great aspirations in all those areas, the things that they actually measured were not there. So and you might notice that a lot of the areas, so good is appearing in green, fair in orange, and poor in red as a qualitative assessment of whether they had performance measures to address these topics and how well they would address those topics. That for auto, most of their measures performed pretty well. They didn't really have anything to talk about vehicle network connectivity, although generally in most places in the United States today, there's pretty good auto network connectivity to just about anywhere you want to go. But for the other modes, for transit, bicycle, and pedestrian, the metrics did not perform as well. And so we, kind of went back to the drawing board and thought about the different metrics that they could use that would address each of these intersections of the transportation network functions and then also the modes. And so coming out of that resulted in kind of 4 broad categories of accessibility, traveler experience, intersection performance, and activity. And so this required a little bit of realignment, but then identified measures that addressed all of those. So thinking about accessibility to different locations, jobs, overall person trips, and looked at those by mode. So by auto, transit, and bicycle and pedestrian, how long those trips took and how easily you could access the transit system itself. Traveler experience, the frequency and span of transit service, how reliable the vehicular network was, and then bicyclist and pedestrian comfort, and I'll go into those two in a bit more detail in a moment. Intersection performance, this comes back to what I was talking about earlier with considering all users and in the operation of the roadway. And so in addition to just the conventional vehicular level of service and thinking about the delay of automobiles at the intersection, we also wanted to think about the delay for transit riders and bicyclists and pedestrians as well. And then just the level of activity. So thinking about the raw total amount of travel by people in each of the major modes: auto, transit, bicycle, and pedestrian. The number of person trips per capita. So also thinking that areas that are denser or have higher populations or more employment centers might have higher levels of travel, and that's okay. That's to be expected. Looking also at vehicle miles of travel per person trip. So again, how much travel in an automobile it would take to accomplish daily travel. So as you move into other modes, transit, bicycle, pedestrian, that would remove vehicle miles of travel, but still accomplish those trip purposes. So getting the benefits out of the transportation without the negative externalities that come along with vehicle miles of travel. And then the vehicle hours of travel, so how long those trips are taking. And then for the safety perspective, crash data, and really kind of flipping that on its head, and instead of thinking about how many crashes are endured, thinking about the number of person trips per collision, so sort of putting the positive outcome of transportation and then the cost or negative externality of that as the denominator. So for bicycle level of traffic stress, this is something that Matthew alluded to earlier. And for folks who aren't familiar, this is the idea that you can look at the built environment that bicyclists are traveling through, as well as the adjacent traffic volumes, and come up with an assessment of how comfortable it would be for a cyclist to ride on that facility. And an important concept here is that this is a weakest link sort of approach. So it doesn't do you much good to have a mediocre bicycling experience along most of the corridor and then have practically a brick wall where it's impossible to cross a given location if your destination is just on the other side of that intersection. So this is an example of doing that type of assessment in Fort Collins, Colorado. where you can see the existing conditions and 2 of the different alternatives and how those improve the level of traffic stress. And the goal was to get to this traffic calming alternative at the bottom that had LTS1, which is a really high quality, high comfort travel experience for cyclists along the corridor. And by the same token, you can think about pedestrian experience the same way, thinking about the width of sidewalks, the width of buffers along those sidewalks, and the distances between crossings and other other physical attributes of the street, and the comfort of a pedestrian traveling along that corridor. One other example I wanted to share was just thinking about any of these performance measures and the way that they affect different groups differently. So this is an example from our autonomous vehicles and equity study that we did with the Union of Concerned Scientists in the MWCOG region, and looking at a variety of different performance measures and then stratifying those by equity emphasis areas. And equity emphasis areas are a concept and a map that the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments has put together that identifies census tracts with higher than average concentrations of low income, minority populations, or both. And so we used that concept to compare outcomes for folks who were living in these areas of concentrated low income and minority population versus the other locations that don't have those concentrations, and did find that the residents who were living in those equity emphasis areas would be exposed to much more congested vehicle miles of travel, and so along with that comes poorer air quality and increased exposure to collisions, and residents of those locations would experience much more exposure than those living in the non-equity emphasis areas. So this kind of stratification can be done with just about any performance measure that has a spatial component, so anything that could be divided by a traffic analysis zone or other census geography, to see how those outcomes would affect different groups. And then the last example that I wanted to share was just thinking about different types of evaluation. Much of the evaluation that we're doing in the transportation space is thinking about things like access and mobility and delay, but there are also opportunities to think of the transportation network as the public realm, and as such thinking about the way that users of that space experience it, and a variety of other performance measures. So this was some work that we did in Los Angeles before they started their Great Streets program, or I guess as part of the Great Streets program, but before they started implementing the projects, and did some benchmarking of the locations that they had identified as great streets, or great locations that wanted to become great streets. And looked at things like neighborhood character. Access and mobility was part of it, but also thinking about the level of economic activity in those locations, the level of community engagement, environmental resilience, and safe and secure communities. And so, ways of looking at the same street and thinking about it not just from a transportation function, but also the different roles that complete streets can play in public space. So with that, unless folks have any questions, we'll take a quick break. Let's meet back. Let's take 10 minutes. So I have 1:58. So if we could meet back at 2:08, we'll dive into the next section on design. Welcome back, everybody. Can you hear me okay? My headphones went out hopefully just as I finished the last section. Okay, good. All right, well, welcome back from the break. We're going to move into the Complete Streets design section. And I think Matthew is up first with some discussion on Complete Streets guidance.
Yeah, I'm going to start out essentially introducing some of the key documents and almost a historic perspective on them, and then we'll get into the actual design attributes by mode, with all of us speaking. This is an older report from 2010, one of the first sort of nationally published reports around complete streets, designing walkable urban thoroughfares from ITE. It was a long time in the making, with a really diverse set of participants in it, and it I think probably went deeper than even some of the current best practices on design, on context-sensitive design manuals out there. So it has a lot of great detail, getting into some of the context things we talked about in terms of defining what the context zones are, but also defining specifically the types of transportation infrastructure that should be present within those contexts. And the one area I think it's sometimes even more detailed is in talking about specifics around lane widths, buffer widths, turning radii, appropriate widths for sidewalks and so forth. So really sort of the grandfather of complete streets types of work. At the same time as this document was published, so on to the next, whoops. There we go. There was also an FHWA webpage and resource, written publications. This is still present as well, also in the same year, around street design and complete streets. Which goes into some of the more detailed stuff about which of these are statutory requirements and so forth. And so just for historical context, at the time that this the FHWA took its first foray into complete streets, Ray LaHood was our Secretary of Transportation, Barack Obama was our president. So sort of it is within my practicing lifetime, but a little bit ago. So that just, I think, speaks to sort of how complete streets is a fairly new concept that's still rapidly evolving. The next evolution of that and sort of the most robust bit was really the formation of a group called the National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO. For those of you who are familiar with sort of traditional design guidelines, design resources for transportation facilities like the American Association of State Highways Transportation Officials, AASHTO, the Green Book, or the MUTCD, the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. All of those types of design manuals are frequently, and especially AASHTO, are frequently written and edited research that's funded to figure out what new elements should be incorporated. A lot of those decisions are made by state DOTs. And there was a consensus amongst agencies, cities that were trying to be more progressive, that there was that was a constraint. So they formed a new organization, NACTO, that was intended to develop design guides that would provide resources for how to design facilities in highly urban areas. And it wasn't a critique of AASHTO, other than to say that state DOT's primary focus is on making sure that the state-run transportation facilities, which are primarily freeways and expressways, operate well, and it's not their focus to think about the highly urban context, and so a different set of resources is needed within those contexts. So NACTO has developed first the bike guide, and then a transit street design guide that we had something to do with as well, and then the urban design bikeway guide. I don't know which of these Tool assisted was, but I'm pretty sure that Tool also, who's a part of our team, also assisted with the development of one of these guides. Then I started practicing transportation in 1990. Coincidentally, that's also the year that the Americans with Disability Act was passed. So a long time ago at this point. ADA is a piece of civil rights legislation. So it essentially says that wherever you're building a facility for an able-bodied person, you also need to build an equal facility for a person who is not able-bodied, whether that be visual impairment or mobility impairment or others. And like a lot of civil rights pieces of legislation, there's initially great resistance to adopting it. And so a lot of the standards for ADA are still unsettled, and one of the areas where things most frequently get settled is in the court system. Essentially, agencies doing less than the ADA would require them to do and being challenged to do more in a legal battle, and in almost all of those cases, losing those cases, and then that setting a precedent for other agencies saying, well, we better not get caught doing that. But there are a couple of resources. One is the ADA Standards for Accessible Design, which was published in 2010. And then the second one is frequently called PROAG, the Proposed Guidelines for Accessible Rights-of-Way, which is also highly contentious and never been formally adopted. So you always that's why it's still called proposed. You're always just sort of pulling up the latest and greatest. I think the benefit is that as we're getting deeper and deeper into these conversations around accommodating people with mobility impairment and vision impairment, the types of conversations we're having are more fine-grained. So rather than talking basically about, whether curb ramps should be present or sidewalks should be present, a lot of the conversations now about how to accommodate blind people at roundabouts and sort of some of the more intricate solutions, but it's very much an evolving practice still. The most recent evolution relative to Maryland and Prince George's County is actually what SHA is doing. So this year they published Context Driven, sort of it's SHA's shot at something akin to what Florida had, defining what contexts are and what types of treatments are appropriate within those contexts. I think it's a huge step forward. It's a great document and website. So I would recommend you take a look at it. And then in parallel to that, they're doing Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, which was just published. The first priority list of action locations was published, I think, just a month or two ago. So great progress. And then as with the Florida guide, it's a little more visual. So if you go on to the next slide, but it does have the different context zones all the way from urban center to rural. And you'll just note that the number of call out boxes of special accommodations for whether it be bikes, peds, transit, or just streetscape environment kind of things. There's a lot more call outs for those types of treatments in the urban centers. And then as you step closer and closer into more auto-centric areas, the number of those accommodations go down. And so it's really helpful, though, just in terms of sort of level setting on what are the types of treatments that should be present in each of these types of contexts. SHA is also doing its first application of this. So we've been working with RK&K, who's also part of this team, on developing the Maryland 185 and 187 context definitions, and so applying context driven to those corridors. I'll just describe 185 to you, which is the Connecticut Avenue north of Chevy Chase Circle. So that section that's 6 lanes wide with a small median, and the lanes are 9.5 feet wide. And one of the key things we've been trying to figure out is sort of how to best apply context driven. In that case, we really relied on crash data to help us make decisions about how to reconfigure or whether to reconfigure that, and have developed a recommendation of converting that 6-lane section to a 5-lane section with buffered bike lanes, really driven by the strong history of rear-end collisions and right-angle collisions, both of which are a product of not having protected left turn pockets along most of the corridor, which makes people make ill-advised decisions about when to turn, and other vehicles stopping in the through lane, which are trying to turn, and others smashing into their back. So I think Maryland is in a great spot in terms of a lot of progress of late, but still sort of finding its legs in terms of how to best apply all these new tools. But it's an exciting time in Maryland. And so that's the sort of historical concept construct. And then with that, I think I'll turn it over to Anjali, who's going to talk first about pedestrians.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. So we're going to start getting into some roadway design concepts. In this section, we'll cover design parameters by mode, and we'll talk about roadway design as well as intersection design and different types of intersection control treatments. And then later on, Alex and Matthew will go into detail on some streetscape design and curbside management. So starting out with pedestrians, and you can, pedestrian facilities are defined by zone. So starting from the building on the left of this image is the frontage zone. The frontage zone is described as the section of the sidewalk that functions as the extension of the building, whether through entryways or doors or sidewalk cafes as shown. And the frontage zone consists of both the structure and the facade of the building fronting the street, as well as the space immediately adjacent to the building. To the right of the frontage zone in the image is the pedestrian through zone. This is the primary accessible pathway that runs parallel to the street, and the through zone ensures that pedestrians have a safe and adequate place to walk, and should be about 5 to 7 feet wide in residential settings, more like 8 to 12 feet wide in downtown or commercial areas. Continuing to the right in the image, we have the street furniture or curb zone, and this is defined as a section of the sidewalk between the curb and the through zone where you might place street furniture or amenities such as lighting and benches, or bike parking could be provided. On the far right of the image is the enhancement or buffer zone. It's the space immediately next to the sidewalk that may consist of a variety of different elements like stormwater management, parking, bike share stations, or curbside bike lanes. Talking about some of the design specifications of these facilities on the next slide, The widths of the sidewalks not only affect pedestrians' usability, but also determine the types of access and other pedestrian elements that can be installed. So for example, a 5-foot sidewalk is probably wide enough to accommodate pedestrian traffic in a residential area, but a much wider sidewalk would be necessary to include amenities such as street furniture. It's important to note that DPWT does have specifications for pedestrian facilities within the county. Design width is defined as extending from the curb or planting strip to any buildings or landscaping that form the opposite borders of the sidewalk. DPWT specifies about a 5-foot minimum sidewalk width along arterial, collector, and industrial roadways. The minimum clearance width is the narrowest point on the sidewalk, and this is an inaccessible minimum width is created when obstacles like utility poles might protrude into the sidewalk and reduce the design width. Larger design widths can accommodate more pedestrians and therefore improve ease of access. There are also specifications on maximum grade, and maximum grade is defined as a limited section of path that exceeds the average grade. So in the pedestrian environment, the maximum grade could be measured over 2-foot intervals, and which is the approximate length of a wheelchair wheelbase or a single walking pace. And in the sidewalk environment, the rate of change of grade should not exceed 13%. There are also sidewalk cross slope grade specifications, and the cross slope runs perpendicular to the center line. And the county specifies a maximum of 2% sidewalk cross slope grade and a maximum of a 1/4 inch differential in elevations between adjacent surfaces that drop curbs and sidewalk ramps. So really trying to limit the drops that you're seeing in between. There are also vertical clearance specifications, and vertical clearance is defined as the minimum unobstructed vertical passage required along the sidewalk. And that can be limited by building overhangs or tree branches protruding into the sidewalk, any signs or awnings. A majority of guidelines require a minimum of 80 inches or a little over 6 feet vertical clearance. On the next slide, we talk about DPWT's urban street design standards, which are applicable in more dense and urban areas of the county. In this guide, it specifies a minimum sidewalk width of 8 feet, although the minimum sidewalk width can vary depending on the scale of development and street typology, and just keeping in mind that greater widths provide greater accessibility. When designing these facilities, street furniture, signs, utilities, and poles, those should all be placed outside of the clear width zone of a sidewalk. And the minimum width may not be enough to satisfy the actual need. So if additional width might be necessary to improve the level of comfort for pedestrians. Moving on to bicyclists and bicycle infrastructure. When thinking about bicycle infrastructure, it's important to remember that bicyclists generally have the same rights and duties as motorists, which means designing for them is similar and based on the same fundamentals of transportation engineering. So some differences for bicyclists are that they have lower speeds and acceleration capabilities, and they have a greater sensitivity to the direction of travel and steep uphill grades. Generally, bicycle travel can be enhanced by bikeways or improvements to the right-hand portion of roadways where bicyclists are required to travel. And when feasible, providing a wider shoulder than the minimum width can be considered. Bicycle travel can also be enhanced with appropriate signage and short-term and long-term parking facilities. Thinking more about bicycle parking, short-term bike on the next slide, short-term bike parking can be convenient and easy to use, and long-term biking should emphasize secure and sheltered access. When designating space for bike parking, you want to consider the locations, the security, the quantity, and the density. On the next slide, we're looking at local parking requirements. Prince George's County does have requirements for bicycle parking that specify the number of spaces required and provide high-level guidance on design. And it's important to note that new requirements are scheduled to go into effect in April of next year that include more detailed space requirements depending on the land use, and more detailed bike rack and locker requirements as well. Getting into the design of different facility types for bicycle infrastructure, when first we have a bike path. When designing for a separated bike path, design considerations should include the exclusive use of bicyclists and in some case pedestrians. If regular pedestrian use is anticipated, separate facilities for pedestrians might be beneficial to minimize conflicts. So really trying to understand whether there's opportunity for a separate facility or not. It's important to remember that sidewalks are not considered bike paths, but where you're providing a bike path and there's no adjacent adequate pedestrian facility and the bike path is going to be available for pedestrians, that means the facility should also meet ADA design criteria. The minimum paved width for a two-way bike path is 8 feet, although 10 feet is preferred. For a one-way bike path, the minimum width is 5 feet. Design speed is generally about 20 miles per hour, except where there are long stretches of downgrades, in which case the design speed should be 30 miles per hour. Thinking about bike lanes, when designing bike lanes on state-maintained facilities, SHA has their bicycle policy and design guide for design criteria. And for county-maintained roadways, DPWT has their urban street design guide that provides design criteria. SHA's design criteria specifies that roadways with long stretches of continuous shoulder should be marked and signed as a designated bike lane, and bike pavement markings should be placed at a minimum after every major intersection and then every half mile with the appropriate bike lane signage. Where the posted speed limit is 35 miles per hour or less, the minimum width for the bike lane is 4 feet. Where the posted speed limit is greater than 45 miles per hour, the minimum width is 6 feet. And in all other locations, the minimum width is 5 feet. Meanwhile, on county-maintained facilities under DPWT, the Urban Street Design Guide specifies a minimum 5-foot width for bike lanes, and where possible to provide a minimum 2-foot striped buffer. Moving forward to thinking about separated bike lanes, DPWT's Urban Street Design Guide talks about recommends separated bike lanes with a mixed use boulevard street typology unless vehicle volumes are extremely low. So this means areas with a mix of land uses, medium to high density, high volumes of vehicles in transit and slow speeds. The separated bike lanes could be raised in line with the sidewalk or not. One-way separated bike lanes with less than 150 bicyclists per hour have a recommended width of 6.5 feet. Otherwise, the minimum is 5 feet in constrained conditions. So buffered bike lanes are good in instances with higher travel speeds, more truck traffic, extra lanes or lane width available, and frequent transit stop conflicts. If we go to the next slide, we can talk about green paint. And the use of green paint or green colored bike lanes is shown here in the image from Silver Spring, and has been approved for use in the county based on FHWA's interim approval. And the next slide shows green paint being used for conflict area markings and colored pavement in conflict areas. Another example here from Silver Spring has been shown to increase awareness and drivers yielding to bicyclists, so increased safety. Our next facility type is a bike route, and bike routes are intended to provide continuity to the bikeway system. They're typically established along through routes that are not served by bike paths or bike lanes, and they're used to connect discontinuous segments of bikeway or discontinuous segments of bike lanes. The facilities are shared with motor vehicles on the street, which are established by placing bike route signage along the roadways, and sometimes shared roadway markings are provided along the route in the street. Since bicyclists are permitted on all highways, the decision to designate the route as a bikeway should be based on the advisability of encouraging bicycle travel on the route and other factors. Routes should only be signed if they provide for through and direct travel in bicycle demand corridors, if they connect discontinuous segments of bike lanes, or they provide the appropriate assignment of right-of-way at intersections to give priority to bicyclists. It's important to remember that the maintenance of a bike route will be at a higher standard than that of other comparable streets. On the next slide, we talk about shared lane markings, and these are used to guide bicyclists on where to ride. They can help to avoid doorings by really specifying where the bicyclist should be in the lane, and they remind drivers that bikes belong. The shared lane marking should not be used on roadways that have a speed limit above 35 miles per hour. There are, of course, exceptions where there is bicycle travel and there's no marked bike lane or shared use path. Or the right-hand traffic lane is too narrow to allow vehicles to safely pass bicyclists. They should not be used in shoulders or designated bike lanes. Our next facility type is a bike boulevard. ENACTO defines a bike boulevard as a street with low vehicle volumes and speeds, and designated or designed to give bicyclists a travel priority. They're basically a collection of treatments that work to achieve the goal of providing a facility that is safe and comfortable for all cycling abilities. And they do that through a combination of volume management and speed management treatments. On the next slide, some of the design considerations for a bike boulevard include using traffic volume management to get vehicular volumes below 3,000 vehicles per day, and using traffic calming to get speeds below 25 miles per hour. This also means evaluating traffic controls to minimize delay. Could mean providing enhanced crossings at busy streets or providing good wayfinding through signage and markings, and also working with emergency responders if any speed management includes speed humps or anything like that. Our next facility type is one-way separated bike lane. Designing for a one-way separated bike lane should consider a desired 7-foot width, although there's a 5-foot minimum, and a 4-foot preferred buffer, although 3 feet is acceptable. Designing the buffer space should consider the use of flex posts and appropriate spacing, and also consider the needs of maintenance vehicles like street sweepers or snow plows. Where there's on-street parking separating the bike lane and traffic, an 8-foot parking lane is desired, although there's a 7-foot minimum. And then it's important to remember that any driveway conflict areas should be marked and signed. On the next slide, we talk about two-way cycle tracks. A two-way cycle track allows for two-way bicycle travel and is most appropriate on one-way streets or in areas with minimal interruptions on one side of the street. In designing two-way cycle tracks, you want to consider whether intersections are large enough or whether they can accommodate a dedicated bike signal phase. Two-way cycle tracks are designed similar to one-way separated bike lanes, but they can allow for a smaller bicycle facility footprint since only one buffer is required and the bike lanes can be slightly narrower. On the next slide, getting into some of the details of the design, the picture on the right shows this. We saw this photo earlier from North Bethesda, but this is an example of an existing two-way cycle track. At a minimum, a two-way cycle track should be 8 feet wide, while 12 feet is preferred. And you want to use a dashed yellow center line to separate the bike traffic and define it as two-way. Ideally, a 4-foot buffer is provided, particularly where the facility is parking protected, and also uses raised flex posts for physical separation. Design should also implement enhanced treatments at any conflict areas like driveways. So an important consideration in designing a two-way cycle track is whether drivers and pedestrians are familiar with the facility and know to expect two-way bicycle traffic at conflict points. so that those enhanced treatments like signage and colored paint can be useful. I mentioned the smaller footprint of a two-way cycle track, and you can think about that with a one-way bike lane. Say you have a one-way separated bike lane that designates 7 feet for the bike and a 4-foot buffer on either side of the street for a total of 22 feet in its footprint, compared to a two-way facility that provides 12 feet for the bike lane and a 4-foot buffer for a total of 16 feet. So there's that difference of 6 feet between the two options in terms of the footprint. Our next slide talks about contraflow bike lanes. And so contraflow bike lanes designate a facility to travel in the direction in the opposite direction of the vehicle traffic. They work best on low volume residential streets with familiar drivers. This slide shows an example from Silver Spring, and you can notice the use of the double yellow to separate vehicular and bike traffic. Important design considerations include providing a wider bike lane facility adjacent to parked vehicles and using shared lane markings in the direction of vehicular flow, where you don't have the width to have a bike lane on the other side of the street. Other design considerations include traffic diverters. They can help to either restrict vehicles or reduce the volumes when needed. On the next slide, we talk about our next facility type, which is a left side bike lane. In some cases, it's appropriate to consider bike lanes on the left side of the roadway when you have a one-way street or places with frequent bus stops or higher right turn vehicle volumes. Instances where having bicyclists on the left side could lower the risk of dooring. These are designed as conventional bike lanes with the same design guidance, just located on the left side of the roadway. On the next couple of slides, we get into some experimental designs. The photo here is of an enhanced shared lane marking, which is currently an experimental design and still needs a formal request for experimental status. FHWA will accept requests to experiment where an agency desires to deploy these for the first time. And you should also consult the Maryland MUTCD for additional information on experimental traffic control devices. On the next slide, we talk about bike boxes, which are being implemented in Maryland. You're seeing a photo here from downtown Silver Spring. They have been granted interim approval by FHWA, and they allow bicyclists to get ahead of traffic during the red signal phase. They do require a no right turn on red signage. You can see that here in the photo, and the green pavement is optional. The next slide talks about two-stage turn queue boxes, which have also been granted interim approval by FHWA. These require both the arrow and the bike stencil when placing them on the pavement. And similar to bike boxes, they do require the no right turn on red signage, and the green pavement is optional. So that takes us through our bicycle facilities, and next up we'll get into design of our transit facilities. At a high level, design for transit facilities should cover 4 areas. The facility type, so some examples could include an exclusive right-of-way for something like bus rapid transit or BRT, or preferential treatment. Is there going to be transit-oriented signal timing provided on the corridor? You also want to consider the bus zone length. So one bus could require anywhere between 80 to 160 feet in length. So how many buses are you planning for in your bus zone? And then thinking about the platform geometry, typically a flat concrete pad adjacent to the roadway is provided at least 8 feet deep and 10 feet long. And the platform should be able to accommodate a passenger shelter, benches, or other facilities without interfering with the pedestrian throughway on the sidewalk. You also want to consider accessibility when designing transit facilities. So considering the curb height could be between 6 inches or 6 to 9 inches. If too high, a bus would be prevented from moving close to the curb and the wheelchair lift operations could be impeded. And if too low or without a curb at all, the elderly or mobility impaired passengers with strollers, they might have difficulty boarding and alighting. Getting into some more of the details in designing transit facilities, selecting the type of application. So for example, are you in a situation with high standard, high speed, 40 to 50 mile per hour multi-lane suburban roads, generally with limited access? Or are you in an environment with lower speeds, shorter blocks, and more urban streets generally have been found in or around centers of concentrated employment like CBD, like central business districts. So you want to balance the sometimes competing requirements in these cases, and that would include considerations for overall road efficiency and just moving people, the transit operational and passenger needs, requirements for street front commercial and residential users, frequency and spacing of cross streets and traffic signals. So considerations for the alignment, the frequency, the span of service, and intersection treatments help to achieve all of the requirements for an ideal transit facility. It's also important to consider the interaction between all the modes in the design of transit facilities. So some of those design considerations should include the passenger information, how you're disseminating information to passengers in terms of real-time arrival information, as an example. What is the pedestrian access like? Are you providing bicycle parking? And what sort of fare collection system are you going to have? There are also many trade-offs in balancing, trade-offs to balance in selecting bus stop location between near side or far side, right lane versus left lane. So we'll discuss a few of the options, and the guide for geometric design of transit facilities on highways and streets from AASHTO is another great resource. So first, prioritizing near side bus stop locations can have advantages such as minimizing interferences when traffic is heavy on the far side. It allows pedestrians to access buses closest to the crosswalk, could eliminate the potential of double stopping, getting through the light and waiting at the red light, getting through and then stopping on the far side. And it could also allow passengers to board and alight while the bus is stopped at the red light. Some disadvantages of near side locations could include increasing conflicts with right turning vehicles, could block the through lane if trying to get over, and could increase sight distance problems for crossing pedestrians. On the other hand, thinking about far side bus stop locations, some of the advantages include providing additional right turn capacity, minimizing sight distance problems, encouraging pedestrians to cross behind the bus, and then allows bus drivers to take advantage of gaps in traffic flow that are created at traffic signal locations. Some of the disadvantages could include the stopped bus could block the intersection. We may increase sight distance problems for crossing pedestrians, could cause the bus to stop on the far side. Again, you could have that double stopping situation, and then could result in traffic queued into the intersection when buses stopped in a travel lane. So from here, we've been able to take our design parameters mode by mode, and then I'll turn it back over to Alex to take us through some principles at the intersection.
Great, thanks, Anjali. Yeah, I'm just going to kick off the intersection design piece with some high-level principles, and then I'm hoping folks are still with us, I'm going to try to ask for a little bit of audience participation and talking through an example of an intersection and some challenges and potential improvements for it. So I'll be doing that in a few minutes. So just starting off, some high-level complete intersections guiding principles, things to consider when you're considering complete streets in the design of an intersection. First of all, just observing the operation of the intersection. How is it currently being used? And perhaps more important than how it's currently being used is maybe how is it not currently being used and other reasons for that. So considering all of those user groups at the intersection and whether they can currently be accommodated or what might be needed to help them be accommodated. And so that's segueing into the idea that pedestrians and bicyclists will be there. They might not be as prevalent, or you might not. They might not be there while you're observing, but it's a good idea to meet the basic pedestrian and bicycle mobility and safety needs at all intersections, rather than just assuming that they won't use the facility, because if their needs aren't met, that's a way to guarantee that they won't use the facility. So it's important to consider the reason for their absence if they're not there. Maintaining and improving facilities, keeping in mind that that the good maintenance of facilities is an especial benefit to pedestrians and bicyclists. Bicyclists in particular are more sensitive and more vulnerable to pavement conditions than automobiles are. It only takes a small crack to grab a tire and potentially create an unsafe situation for a bicyclist. And similarly with sidewalk conditions, if there's upheaval of concrete sidewalks, that can create a challenging environment to navigate, particularly for users of wheelchairs. The next one, Tee It Up, is about 90-degree intersections, and the idea that creating 90-degree intersections rather than skewed intersection geometries improves sight lines and also helps with the speed of turning vehicles. If you have a vehicle turning on a wide obtuse angle, they tend to take those turns at higher speeds. And related is slowing it down. So using treatments that reduce the speed of motorized vehicles at intersections while also maintaining operational efficiency. So this can be, along with teeing it up, thinking about reducing the curb radii for the same reason that if you have a very large curb radius or a kind of smooth curve from one road into the next, vehicles tend to take those at higher speeds. Shortening crossing distances, so reducing the crossing distance also reduces the time that it takes for pedestrians and bicyclists to cross the intersection, and that results in less exposure to crashes. That could just be narrower lanes, but also fewer lanes to cross to help to improve safety. Improving visibility, so good design makes the motorists more aware that bicyclists and pedestrians are expected to be there, and making it easier for motorists to see the pedestrians and bicyclists helps them to anticipate them. Clarifying the right-of-way, so making it very clear where pedestrians and bicyclists have the right-of-way. So that might be striping bike lanes to the left side of a right turn-only lane to reduce the risk of collisions there, and marking the pavement to reinforce the idea that pedestrians and bicyclists have right-of-way and do belong there. Keeping pedestrian crossings direct. So a common strategy for improving vehicular operations at a signalized intersection is removing some of the pedestrian crossing legs. And while that can help to improve operations for vehicles, it definitely makes things much less convenient for pedestrians. So if you have only 3 legs of crosswalks at an intersection, for someone trying to make that 4th leg, they have to make 3 crossings of the street, which increases their exposure and just makes things more inconvenient. Lighting at night increases safety and security for pedestrians and bicyclists. And then it's important to keep in mind throughout all of this that access for all is essential. So maintaining pedestrian facilities in a way that meets or exceeds the ADA requirements. A few other things to consider. Think about the volumes and abilities of pedestrians using the facility, and age ranges can be a particular thing to keep in mind, in that older pedestrians may have challenges with depth perception, vision, judgment, hearing, and walking speed. So when thinking about the time it takes to clear an intersection as a pedestrian is crossing. Similarly, thinking about the volumes and abilities of bicyclists, that the skill level of bicyclists also affects their comfort in bicycle facilities and the general roadway design. Thinking about the characteristics of bicycles when designing facilities, so they have different acceleration and stopping characteristics than vehicles. Also thinking about their turning radius, the length of a bike, and the width of the bicycle affecting the design of the facility. And then finally, vehicle and motorist characteristics. Similarly, the size and maneuverability of motor vehicles. Thinking about the curb, corner radii, and roadway widths. And then the motorist's ability to perceive and react to objects and potentially people in the roadway. Land use context is also important, whether there's street parking present, whether transit is going to be operating on the facility, where the intersection is located relative to development density and uses that might introduce additional considerations. And then just thinking about different intersection types, three-leg, skewed intersections, special cases, and roundabouts. So with all of those high-level principles in mind, this is what I was mentioning of having a little bit of interaction. I'm curious to hear from the group. This intersection is located in Davis, California, so commonly thought of as a very pedestrian and bicycle-friendly place. But I think, and hopefully you all will agree, that there's some challenges with this intersection, and I'd like to open it up for the group to identify some issues that they see here.
Hi, my name is Glenn Burton. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
I have a question regarding the placement of the bus stop near side versus far side. I guess for me personally, as a driver, I would prefer when I'm entering the intersection, the bus is to my right than it is to my left. And I understand I saw all of the pros and cons, but for me, the biggest con is the fact that the bus is affecting my sight distance. And this is also true in my neighborhood when cars are parked on the street and I'm coming out of my driveway and I look to my left and there's a car that's parked to the left of me. And so I have to go further out into the intersection to get around this parked bus or car or whatever it is. So given all the pros and cons, is there a preferred side where a bus stop should be placed?
Yeah, good question. Anjali, do you want to take that one?
I think it really gets down to agency preferences and how they want to balance the advantages and disadvantages. I don't think there's an industry preference between near side or far side, because as you can see from the two slides, the trade-offs are pretty equal between the two options. So I think it just comes between the agency, like the agency's decision on what to emphasize. Yeah.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. But I think, Glenn, your points about especially sight distance for pedestrians is one that I think agencies in highly urbanized area probably a little bit more favor the far side stop and for the reasons you're describing. But I think all agencies, and I think there is some benefit to being consistent, so the transit users and others sort of have some expectation about where to find transit stops. But agencies also want to allow some flexibility for, like, if you're going to do a queue jump lane or something else of that nature, then you might want to consider a different stop location. But for the most urbanized areas, I think most I've seen do prefer the far side stops.
Can I just make one follow-up question, and I promise I won't dominate the evening. The driver expectation is an important consideration. I'm guessing that's why they invented the MUTCD to promote uniformity. So there's something to be said about uniformity. And I don't really have a question, and I don't want to sound preachy, but I like when things look the same because of my expectation. That's all I have.
Yeah, thank you. That's a helpful perspective.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks call that intuitive design. Sort of things are where you expect them to be. Yeah, we would agree.
Yeah, and that's a helpful reminder for me before we jump into that exercise. Are there any other questions or comments from the group on the material we've covered so far? I think we're doing okay on time. And if not, I'd love to hear any thoughts about this intersection.
Alex, it's Rick Kegel, with RKNK.
Hi, Rick.
Hi. I am not a fan of the high-speed right turn lanes. I prefer to bring the right turning vehicle into the intersection so you control them along with the crosswalks.
Yep, that's a great point.
Okay, I guess I'm not going to let that go unchallenged. Can I just respond to that last comment? I know this is not a challenge. I'm sorry. The age-old question of trade-offs and safety versus capacity, not exactly an original thought, but in a situation like this, where obviously when you have a right turn lane, or in some cases a free right turn, which helps the overall capacity in that more vehicles can go through the intersection without coming to a complete stop. But as you said, in terms of safety, when things tend to be safer when you force people to stop, although that's not universally true. So I guess my question is a question of trade-offs. How do you decide how much leeway to give to safety versus capacity at the end of the day? And I know that's not the easiest question to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think some of the sort of high-level principles that we talked about earlier apply. Thinking back to Matthew's discussion of the layered networks and prioritization at different locations, that tends to be more at a street segment or facility level, but where those facilities intersect can also be places where you'd apply that. So there might be an auto emphasis corridor that might really be focused on auto operations and might not make as many of these affordances for more vulnerable road users. But on the flip side of that coin, if you have emphasis for bicyclists or pedestrians or even transit facilities, you might be more willing to make those trade-offs of vehicular capacity or operations for the other demands.
Just one observation about the specific design of these right turn lanes. So even I appreciate your point, Glenn, and as Alex said, it's sort of context should be part of your consideration of whether this is an auto priority location. But even if it is, the way that these particular right turns are designed, especially as a vehicle is merging into the receiving lane, just what we know about, especially an older population of drivers and ability to turn your head more than 90 degrees in order to see a car that you're merging into is quite difficult. So even if you were to leave this as either a free right, so the sort of the worst case scenario from a safety perspective, there's ways to square it up so that it's not such a broad sweeping free right. So the general guidance is it should approach at about a 65-degree angle rather than this almost 45-degree angle, so that a vehicle that's trying to merge can see a vehicle to its left more readily, and also has to slow down to a speed that's maybe more appropriate to their potential to yield to a pedestrian who might be in that crosswalk. So I think there's sort of gradients of safety enhancements that could be done here. Everything from what Rick's suggesting, which is essentially to consolidate those right turn lanes back into the intersection or scrap them altogether, all the way just to redesigning them so they're slower speed and better sight triangles.
Yeah, maybe we could go ahead and move into some of those potential solutions for the intersection. So this is a set of low-cost solutions. So a few of the things that are showing up are maintaining that free right, but incorporating a raised crosswalk that's designed to slow down vehicles. So it still doesn't require the vehicle to stop unless there is a pedestrian in the crossing, but does at least slow them down so they can make that determination. The green paint used to clarify the bicyclist right of way in the conflict zones and continuing travel through the intersection. And then here coming up to the intersection where we do have a 90-degree intersection, the advanced stop bars that help to improve the visibility of the pedestrians, maybe even combined with a leading pedestrian interval to get the pedestrians out into the roadway before the signal changes. And then this might be more along the lines of what Rick was proposing of, these would tend to be higher cost solutions that involve moving the curb and maybe even building out additional curb. but it does replace those free right turn lanes with smaller curb radii that would reduce vehicle speed, so allowing the vehicle to navigate this this conflict between the bicyclist proceeding straight and the vehicle trying to turn right, coming up to a tighter curb radius that that requires the vehicle to slow down before making that turn. And again, the advanced stop bars and the green conflict markings. And just one more piece that I wanted to throw out there was bulb outs or curb extensions. So the last example was kind of building entirely new curb, but these can be sort of either part of a new design or a retrofit to an existing curb that just extends the curb out into the parking lane or that nearer lane to the curb to help to improve visibility. So it shortens the pedestrian crossing distances and again clarifies and narrows the crossing so that the pedestrians are only exposed in the piece of the crossing where they actually are interacting with the vehicles crossing the intersection. It also helps to tighten the curb radii and encourage safer turning speeds, and also creates an opportunity for 2 curb ramps per corner, which is a big accessibility issue, especially for people with vision impairment, where if you have diagonal crossing ramps, they tend to direct the crossing pedestrians out into the middle of the intersection. And if you have 2 90-degree faces of the curb that result from the curb extension coming into the crossings, it allows for a directional curb ramp that directs the pedestrian to cross at a 90-degree angle to the oncoming traffic. And just a key consideration here is that while it's helpful for the curb extension to bulb out into the parking lane, that idea of visibility is still important. So this is not blocking the view of turning vehicles and also not to infringe on the bicycle lane. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Anjali to talk about uncontrolled crossings.
Yeah, when we're designing for uncontrolled crossings, there are a few tools at our disposal. The first of which is high visibility markings. So high visibility crosswalk markings can improve the visibility and improve safety. The longitudinal stripes that you see in the image are more visible to drivers, and they can also last longer than the transverse stripes, especially if they're staggered to avoid the vehicle wheel paths, which is what you're seeing in that top right image. They are considered appropriate at all crossings and should always be used for mid-block crossings at uncontrolled intersections. We also have curb extensions, and which are sidewalk extensions at intersections that reduce the roadway width from curb to curb, as Alex was just talking through. They shorten the crossing distance for pedestrians and improve sight lines to pedestrians waiting to cross. They also reduce the effective turning radius and turning speed by preventing drivers from cutting diagonally across the shoulder to turn. So really they improve safety at these uncontrolled crossings by shortening the distance and kind of minimizing the length of time that pedestrians are exposed. And the final tool at our disposal are the advanced yield lines. Advanced yield or stop lines are standard white stop or yield limit lines. They're placed 20 to 30 feet in advance of marked or uncontrolled crosswalks. This addresses the multiple threat situation for pedestrians in the crosswalk, and that's what happens when where one driver yields and the second driver in the adjacent lane does not. In this instance, both the driver in the second lane and the pedestrian in the crosswalk have their line of sight blocked by the first yielding vehicle. So this treatment increases the pedestrian's visibility to motorists and reduces the number of vehicles encroaching on the crosswalk. At mid-block locations, crosswalks alone are not enough. So additional design interventions can include warning signage, yield lines, raised pedestrian refuge or medians, which is an example of what you're seeing here in the photo, curb extensions, or even enhanced lighting. The rectangular rapid flashing beacons, or RRFBs, is a variation on the conventional flashing beacon with the traditional slow flashing incandescent lamps replaced with rapid flashing LED lamps. And the beacon could be push button activated or passively activated with pedestrian detection. It has received interim approval from FHWA in Maryland. And then there's also the pedestrian hybrid beacon or HAWK signal, which is effective in reducing pedestrian and vehicle conflicts and slowing traffic speeds. The HAWK signal is a pedestrian actuated signal that is a combination of a beacon, flasher, and a traffic control signal. When activated by a pedestrian push button, the HAWK displays a flashing yellow, then a solid yellow, advising motorists to prepare to stop. The signal then displays a solid red and shows the pedestrians a walk indication. During the pedestrian clearance interval, the driver sees a flashing red wigwag pattern until the interval has ended and the signal goes dark. The HAWK is useful in areas where it's difficult for pedestrians to find gaps in vehicle traffic to cross safely and where a normal signal warrant isn't satisfied. The HAWK is more appropriate for multi-lane roadways where the benefits of the device can be more fully realized. And this has also received interim approval by FHWA. And from there, we'll get into signalized intersection treatments, and I'll turn it back over to Matthew.
Thanks, Anjali. Most of this materials comes from a publication that's was made by America Walks called Signalized Intersection Enhancements that Benefit Pedestrians. And we'll first talk about signal hardware. We talked earlier about sort of evolution of practices. For a long time, countdowns were controversial, and then there was some difference of opinions about how they should be done. But now I think there's pretty broad consensus and national mandate that countdowns are part of all new signal installations and signal modifications. And there's pretty strong proof that they have safety benefits, not just for pedestrians, but actually a San Francisco study demonstrated that they also had improved safety outcomes for vehicle traffic. There's also a movement afoot around turn restriction signs, especially those turn restrictions that have sort of time of day sub banners to them, have been found to be pretty ineffective. There's too much information there for users to really absorb, and it gets to be a bit of sign clutter. And so the idea of doing blank out signs that have LED signs that are not lit when the turn restriction is not in effect, and then it's turned on when the turn restriction is in effect, has really been shown to take up the drivers take a lot more awareness of those and are much more likely to follow the direction of the blank out signs. Left turn signals, there's lots of great guidance on this now in terms of just thresholds at which thresholds of volumes and conflicts at which dedicated left turn pockets should be considered, and then dedicated left turn phasing should be considered. So there's lots of great resources here. Alex was talking earlier about compact intersections and trying to keep signal timings to a minimum. So there's always a trade-off when we're talking about signal phasing around sort of balancing the desire to have really short cycle length, 60-second or less in most urban areas, with trying to do dedicated or protected turn phasing, because every time you add additional phases, you make the cycle lengths longer. But the research on safety benefits of protected left turn lanes, especially where you have high conflicts between vehicles that are turning left, in a scenario where it's not protected, where it's permitted lefts, vehicles who are making that left at the same time as the adjacent pedestrian crosswalk has a walk indication. The safety research is pretty definitive that actually providing a dedicated left turn pocket and left turn phase is a great safety benefit. Push buttons, there's been a lot of progress in this area as well. I'd say the most recent sets of progress relate to identifying locations where pedestrian recall is put in place, where you don't want or need a pedestrian push button. In DC in particular, and other progressive cities, oftentimes they'll continue to have a push button so that blind pedestrians can get an audible message out of the signal, but that able-bodied pedestrians don't need to push that button. The signal gives them a walk every cycle. There's been more emphasis around that during COVID, with the idea that you don't really want everybody touching a common surface. And it's interesting, in the Canadian version of ADA, they actually had a case law that indicated that requiring a user or pedestrian to push a button while vehicles did not have to push a button was not equal treatment under the law. So there's all sorts of stuff, evolutions around push buttons. And there's also great evolutions, not so much in terms of the new technology, but in terms of the reliability of technology for detection of pedestrians and cyclists. So there's infrared and video, and they're getting better and better as time goes on. I won't go through the RFB and the pedestrian hybrid beacon because Anjali already did. But in terms of operations, Alex talked quickly about some of these when we were talking, when he was giving the example in Davis, but one of them is a leading pedestrian interval, which is essentially usually a 3-second all red for vehicles, in which pedestrians get to establish their presence in the crosswalk. The idea being that allowing the pedestrian to establish right of way sends a signal that the automobiles are more likely to sort of adhere to acknowledge there's a pedestrian in the crosswalk. And there's also safety research, coincidentally out of San Francisco again, indicating that these are really pretty effective. Talked about short cycle lengths and sort of trade-offs around that. Ped scrambles have been used in a number of locations, either as just letting pedestrians cross on all 4 approaches at once while vehicles have an all red, or in some cases, as in the example on the top of this in Pasadena, where you're allowing pedestrians to cross diagonally. You do need to make sure you you allocate more time for the clearance interval because it's a longer crossing distance if you're going to allow pedestrians to cross diagonally. But the idea is that where you have strong demand, that this is sort of a priority treatment in a downtown area where you're really encouraging pedestrians to take over the street for a part of the phase. And this is done in Chinatown in DC and in other areas, but that's the primary one I've seen it in our region. Talked about no right turns on red in terms of or blank out signs, and those are often applied now to right turn on red signs as well. Again, wherever there's a time of day restriction on the right turn on red, those have really been shown to be pretty ineffective, and so the blank out signs are much more effective. And I also already talked about ped recall, so I won't go into that. On the bike detection, also getting better just in terms of ability of our equipment to really, the infrared and video and loops to detect when a bicycle is present, although especially with loops, I have this all the time of not being detected. There are a couple of newer items available in terms of signs indicating that the bicyclists should position themselves in a certain place, and also a pavement stencil that can be used to indicate the bicyclists where they position their bike in order to get detection. And I think bike signal faces are also, I think this is this another picture courtesy of Michael? If not, he did send us a bunch, but bike signal faces are one of the innovations that was invented in Davis probably over a decade ago, but now is part of national practice and also present in Silver Spring in Maryland now. So the idea is that you have a signal that is specifically directing bicycles on what activities they want to make through the intersection. Bikes can follow if they're in the lanes, in the traffic lanes, they generally would follow the vehicular signals. If it's in a multi-use trail environment, sort of off the street, then they would generally follow the pedestrian indications. And both of those are appropriate and fine in many instances, but in some instances, especially in situations where you're expecting bicyclists to either understand the movement like a diagonal or something else that's out of the norm, or you're expecting them to do something that's different than the traffic thing they're sharing with cars in the street or with pedestrians in the sidewalk environment, then it's helpful to have a dedicated signal that really provides more clear direction to what expectations are for cyclists in those instances. Then the latest evolution is protected intersections and protection corners. For those of you who've been practicing as long as I have, this is almost the antithesis of what I was taught bringing when I came up through school, which was that as you approach an intersection, in the old days, the thought was you really want to make sure that you have bikes and vehicles in clear visibility of one another, and so you want to dash the bike lane and allow the car to merge across if it's going to be turning right. And the idea is that everybody can see each other. They're all going to behave predictably, and it's I think what we've learned over the course of time is that that's a scenario that only a small percentage of cyclists actually feel comfortable riding, and that if we want to expand the number of people who are comfortable riding, then providing protected facilities, both mid-block and then now in the more recent advent through the intersections, is really a way that makes inexperienced cyclists, less capable cyclists, feel more comfortable choosing to ride a bicycle. And so protected intersections are the latest evolution of that. But some of the things we were hoping that we accomplished out of mixing bikes and peds at intersections in terms of visibility are the very things that we then are trying to design into these protected intersections. So you can see there's this sort of football shaped island that really requires vehicles to slow down to make the right turn. There's all sorts of green paint to really indicate this is a conflict zone for bikes and vehicles. There's a great segregation or separation between PEDs and bikes, and the use of truncated domes to make sure that PEDs don't just walk into the bike zones as well. So lots of great evolutions here. And this is actually from the Massachusetts DOT, so there isn't a national standard on protected intersections yet, but MassDOT, which Tool, who was part of our team, did write, has this, has developed a guide, I think probably 5 or so years ago, that I think a lot of people still use as a best practice for many of the more progressive NACTO bike guide treatments. I'm sorry, more progressive bike design treatments. And then there is another version of AASHTO currently in the works that may include these more formally. And then there are some design parameters around the spatial elements of protected bike lanes and protected intersections. In terms of the widths of medians, wanted to make sure you have any medians are long enough for a bike to fit within there, so that the front and rear tires aren't hanging out either into the into the pedestrian environment or into the lanes. And then other areas, making sure that when a vehicle does stop and yield to a pedestrian or bicyclist in the crosswalks, that they're not impeding traffic. And then the final one just around curb returns to make sure that the vehicles really do have to slow down dramatically in order to go around corners in these instances. The last section for me, at least, is along streetscapes and placemaking. And it's pretty short, mostly because we sort of know your lane. We are transportation planners and traffic engineers. We are not. I am not a landscape architect or urban designer. So we'll talk about these quickly. And there's lots of great progress being made and ideas around making sure that when you design places, you think about it in a comprehensive fashion, almost like you would if you're designing a building or a room. But this is a pretty quick section. So streetscape refers to urban roadway design and conditions as they impact street users and nearby residents. An important component of public realm. So that's the major concept in here, is just sort of making sure you design these places for people to not just travel through, but also be. One of the key measures of public realm in sort of some of the more pivotal analysis, like Better Market Street in San Francisco, and I'm sorry, I'm from San Francisco, so I have a lot of San Francisco examples, is really observations around how many people just interact and hang out as opposed to just travel through. So trying to create places that are comfortable for people to do that, which often relates to things like aesthetic quality, having a sense of place or identity, and then having places to shop and things to look at and other things beyond just mobility. There's a number of elements with respect to streetscapes. There's a whole science around building and essentially the relationship between building height and street width, and getting that in a way that in a similar sort of fashion that you might to a building, to make sure that those two are in proportion to one another. It creates a sense of scale, a pedestrian scale that encourages people to walk. So there's a whole science around that. There's a whole science around signage and marking, and some of this is actually really pretty interesting. Some of you may know that there's some experimentation, not so much in the US, but a little bit in the US, but especially in Dutch countries, around removal of signage and pavement markings to create scenarios where users are just more cautious in the area because there is some ambiguity. So sort of the counterpoint to the one we were having earlier about creating predictability, creating a lack of predictability in order to create a sense that everybody should just be really cautious. And and also a sense that this is a pedestrian priority area. There's also often an emphasis around street trees and lighting and bed scale, furniture and so forth as part of streetscape projects as well. Then I'm going to wrap on experimental and demonstration projects. Anjali was really good in going through the sections that have interim approval, where she was talking about the various improvements, those that have interim approval. And we do have a whole resource on that if you ever have questions on what is the approval status of different NACDO bike treatments or some of the newer crosswalk, Pat Evans beacons and the like treatments. We have an entire document that's pretty useful on that. We'd be happy to share it with folks. But you can see that this is a field that has transportation design in general that has evolved, and so there is a need for flexibility. There's a need to be able to continue to experiment and try different things. And so there is a formal approval process that is in place. My experience is that many agencies choose not to actually undergo the formal process, and so many of the pictures that I'll show you later on, either the agency decided not to undergo the formal process because they deemed that it wasn't really a new traffic control device or worthy of experimentation, or in some cases agencies just deemed that the process to follow the national and federal and national and state practices is so onerous that they won't. That they don't have the resources to do that, and I'll show you the graph on that in a moment. But one of the keys to anytime you're experimenting with new things is just making sure you have a really good paper trail, and that paper trail should include collaboration with your anybody who might have a stakeholder interested in that, particularly within your agency organization. So making sure that if you're going to try something new, you've got a really strong rationale for why you think it's worth trying that thing new. Preferably consensus amongst your engineering, planning, enforcement staff that that's something worthy of experimentation and sort of worthy of taking on the risk. And having that paper trail really can be helpful in the event that something unfortunate does happen and you're trying to justify in a legal case why it is you did that thing. I should note that I am not a liability and tort expert, but you have one in Prince George's County, again, in Michael Jackson. So I know that I've seen him speak at TRB and other conferences about specifically tort liability. So this is one that internal to your organization, you have great resources. And so I would ask you to avail yourselves of those, especially as you're contemplating any experimentation processes. And the SHA and FHWA experimentation process is on the next slide. Not sure if you can quite make it out. I'm going to zoom in on my version, but at the very top is an agency requesting permission to experiment, and then FHWA will either grant that right to experiment or ask questions and ask the agency to resubmit again. Once you've received permission to experiment, then there's usually a series of specific criteria that you're trying to accomplish. What outcomes are you trying to achieve, and then you have to evaluate those. Oftentimes, initially, that's sort of on a spot basis. You're looking at whether that thing worked, and so that's the box on the left. Evaluate on the experimental traffic control device, and then often you'll get sort of an interim approval, but you'll also have to then do a subsequent process of annual reporting on how things go. So your initial experimentation might have favorable outcomes, but you're going to want to track it over time, and then ultimately these get incorporated into design manuals and the like. As you can expect from this and just all the parties that are involved in it and the steps on the way, it's tough. It's often tough to get the feds and the state to agree to experiment. It's tough to get to define a set of evaluation criteria that are inexpensive to measure. It's tough to produce reports, and so it can be expensive and very time consuming. And I think that's why a lot of agencies approach it with great caution. Beyond those actual sort of formal processes, as I said earlier, there's a bunch of things that people do for mostly treatments that they don't deem to be new traffic control devices. So most of these are streetscape improvements that I'll show over the next couple of slides. And that oftentimes are done through tactical urbanism or demonstration projects. And so these can be time of day, a very short-term implementation over just a couple of days in order to see if something works, or it could be done on an interim basis. Oftentimes agencies will do a tactical urbanism install with the expectation that if it goes well, they'll ultimately replace it with more permanent infrastructure, and they'll leave that tactical element in place until they can afford to do the more permanent installation. So a couple examples of those, again, going to California. I think Alex showed another segment of Michigan Avenue in Santa Monica where they used temporary building materials. The plants are still in their planter boxes and the like, and paint, street furniture to really cone or to divide off an area of the street, but did it in a way that's easy to remove and low cost. So this is between $15,000 and $30,000, and then the elements of materials that are there. The costs shown here are just for the materials, not labor. And then here's another example, also in Santa Monica, of a neighborhood traffic circle that's done all with temporary materials. Again, sort of similar cost range to install. And then another example from California, this one's from Long Beach, where they used cones that they already own, so there's no actual hard cost associated with this, but of course there is a labor cost associated with putting out and taking down these types of demonstration projects. And then many agencies also experiment with signs, usually with some sort of community survey or survey of users to see, was that helpful? But whether it's wayfinding signage or just sort of education signs around appropriate ways to behave in your walking and riding or driving. There's lots of experimentation and on low cost signs. So this is one, and this is that's from Glendale, California. And then sort of the mother of demonstration projects on the next slide. Sort of many of you are aware that under Jeanette Sutcon, the New York Department of Transportation went through and did just a host of really aggressive pedestrian plazas, including Times Square, where they used essentially permanent building materials, but low-cost permanent building materials. So the areas that you see in sort of the tan is actually they put down an adhesive onto the asphalt and then sprinkled on top of that gravel to create a sense that it's a different operating environment than the travel lane and the sidewalk. But without having to modify drainage and the like. And then many of the installation elements are still temporary, but fairly heavy to move, like a lot of these planter installations. So they're temporary, but maybe they're removable, but not easily removed. And so these have a higher cost, but have really gone a long way in sort of creating place. In New York, they've gone a long way in creating a lot of incentive for other neighborhoods to ask for these. So they've taken on sort of life of their own. The last slide for me is just that there is good guidance on tactical urbanism. There's a Canadian guide, a planner's guide to tactical urbanism, and then a more recent one that's done by the Congress of New Urbanism called Tactical Urbanism 2, that have good resource guides in terms of materials that you can use and some of the design parameters to use. So there's good resource material for that. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Alex for the last section.
Thanks, Matthew. Yep, this is our last section on curbside management, and I know we're getting close to the end of our time. We have until 4 p.m., but I think we're trying to keep it to 3:30. So I'll just briefly go over the curbside management information, and then we'd be happy to take any questions and get you all on with your afternoons. So the main thing that I wanted to highlight in the curbside management space, we're actually currently working with the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, NCHRP, on a practitioner's guide for dynamic curbside management that should be coming out next summer. But a lot of the work that laid the groundwork for that was in this ITE curbside management practitioner's guide. And I just wanted to make sure that folks were aware of this, as the curb is part of the complete streets environment, and often where a lot of the biggest changes are afoot. Before the pandemic, transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft were increasingly prevalent and increasingly making demands on the use of the curb space. And then as we've seen during the pandemic, the demand for small local deliveries, takeout, Uber Eats, those sorts of things, as well as package delivery, have just skyrocketed. So looking for ways to manage some of those demands while also keeping in mind the other uses of the curb for mobility, placemaking and the like. So this guide is freely available on the ITE website. I'd encourage you to check it out. I won't go too deep into it, but it does describe some of the tools and treatments that are available for addressing uses at the curb. It gives some guidance on a process for making decisions about allocating that curb, and I'll just touch on the first three elements. The last two are important, assessing and sharing those alternatives that you decide on with the public for feedback and modification and iteration, and then refining and implementing the treatments. But I'll speak briefly to the first three, which are taking an inventory of the existing conditions of the curb, identifying the context in which that curb is located, and then selecting some treatment alternatives. So on the topic of inventorying existing conditions, I just want to call attention to another report that we worked on with Uber in San Francisco, which was a pretty detailed inventory of the use of the curb in, I think it was 4 different locations in San Francisco, and we've since done another study similarly in Cincinnati. Important to think about what the policies and bylaws and codes are that are in place in the location. But the core of the work that we did in San Francisco was thinking about the supply, demand, and utilization of the curb, how that curb space was designated and how use was restricted, and then thinking about the needs and opportunities for that space. And so one of the key metrics that came out of that work was this notion of curb productivity. And so we observed the use of the curb over a period of time and divided the curb lane up into units of parking space, and then observe that over time. So the space hour was sort of our unit of analysis, and we looked at how many passengers a section of curb over a period of time, a space hour, could serve. And this chart just shows one typical experience at a location, in which you can see is that parking, while it is an important use of the curb, can often be relocated off of the curb to an off-street parking location. And it serves relatively few users compared to shuttles, taxis, passenger pickup and drop off, and transit vehicles. So while that one parked car might be sitting there for several hours and only serving one person, a shuttle or taxi could be doing more than 100 times as much to serve travelers in that location. So important example of inventorying what's currently taking place at the curb and how those uses are interacting. And then kind of harkening back to the modal prioritization that Matthew described on a network basis, it's also important to think about for any given street face or section of curb, how to prioritize use of that curb, the mode, the use, and again, it's important to think not just of what the current use is that's observed, but also desired uses. And often some of the unlawful behavior that's observed can be an indicator of what some of the demand for the curb is. So when you see delivery vehicles double parking, passenger vehicles double parking, that those can be signs that there's a need to accommodate those uses, but it might just not be right there at that curb or right there in the particular way that they're currently taking place, and there might be a safer or a more orderly way to accommodate them. And then also the context. So this is an example from Seattle where in residential locations, access for people is paramount, and then in commercial and mixed use locations, access for commerce takes precedence over that, followed by access for people, and then a variety of other curb uses. And then finally, this is from an ACTO document, curb appeal, that was even the precursor to the ITE Curbside Practitioner's Guide, and has since been kind of subsumed into it. This is just a graphic that identifies a variety of different alternative treatments, and the San Francisco Uber curb study that I showed earlier also has a lot of treatment examples for handling some of those loading, pickup, and drop-off parameters, and how to reallocate the curb for smoother use. And so with that, we'll call it a wrap. I do want to open up for any questions or comments from the group, and certainly you're also welcome to follow up with us after. I did see one question about if we can make the presentation available, and I think that should be okay. I think this is also being recorded, and so I'll coordinate with Crystal on how we can get that disseminated to the group.
Looks like Crystal has her hand up.
Right, that was going to be my next question. It may be that we have to put it on the website just because of the size of the document as well as the recording. So we will work internally to figure out the best way to disseminate the information to everyone. Also, if anyone is interested in the information for the pedestrian action, the SHA's pedestrian safety action plan meeting, I will go ahead and put that in the chat because that's one of the things that we mentioned earlier on. And if there are other links that we have forgotten, or if there's other information that people are looking for, we can work together to try to figure out how we can get that information and what's the best way to do that. All right, but thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I know it's a lot of information to digest, so I'll let folks continue to do that. And as Crystal said, if there are questions after the presentation, feel free to reach out and we can help you to locate those resources. And yeah, thanks everyone for your participation today and coming for the training.